The year is 1757, and in the rolling hills of Bohemia, a battle is about to unfold. One that will shatter Prussia's aura of supremacy and bring about its darkest hour. Frederick the Great, the warrior king who had transformed Prussia from a humble duchy into a European powerhouse, is hailed as invincible, his strategies revolutionary, and his leadership unmatched. But by nightfall, his grand ambitions lie scattered across the blood-soaked fields of Kolín. Yet even in this defeat, he knew that great things are achieved only when we take great risks. By 1757, Europe's alliances had undergone a dramatic realignment. Former enemies, France and Austria, now joined forces, with Russia soon following suit to encircle Prussia. Saxony, whose 1756 invasion by Frederick's armies had ignited the wider war, formally entered the coalition, and Sweden threw its weight against Prussia as well. It was only Great Britain who remained at Frederick's side, offering much-needed subsidies, but little in the way of troops. This diplomatic revolution left Prussia isolated on the continent, its king beset by a ring of powerful adversaries. Realizing he must strike before the noose tightens, Frederick launches a bold invasion of Bohemia in the April of 1757. His 113,000-strong army advances in 4 columns, converging on Prague. On May the 6th, Frederick wins a victory outside the city, forcing the defeated Austrian army behind Prague's walls and to fall under siege. Field Marshal Leopold von Daun, however, was already assembling a relief force of 60,000 men to the east. Frederick, leaving Field Marshal Keith to maintain the siege of Prague with 50,000 men, moved eastward, with the remainder of his army to intercept Daun before the 2 Austrian forces had a chance to unite. By mid-June, destiny awaited both armies near the small town of Kolin. Never did troops march less willingly than our men on this occasion. It was as if they were being led to a place of execution. They were shocked by the resistance the Austrians had put up at Prague, and they feared the worst. Our strength and courage seemed to have drained away. The battlefield of Kolín stretched along the Kaiserstraße, the Imperial Highway. I'll let Thomas from the past take it from here. This was the old Kaiserstraße. It was an imperial road connecting Prague to Vienna, and it was central to the entire battlefield, because it was wide enough and had good infrastructure to support columns of troops like Frederick's. About 1.5 kilometers south of this road lay a series of low ridges, with 2 modest hills named Przeworski Hill to the west and Kresor Hill to the east. These heights provided the Austrians with excellent defensive positions. Any attacker would have to cross open farmland covered in summer crops, advancing uphill and under artillery fire. So I am right now standing where the Austrians would have stood defending Kresor Hill. You can notice that the main feature of this battlefield is the climb from the Imperial Strasse in the background right there to the defensive ridgeline that the Austrians were holding here between the 2 hills. The climb itself is about a 6% grade, so you can imagine that in the summer heat of 1757, the Prussians would have become exhausted attacking here. Furthermore, this was not a coincidence. The Austrian Field Marshal Daun, he had learned from his previous failures and mistakes, and he now knew that by occupying a strong defensive position between 2 hills, he was to gain an unobscured view of the oncoming Prussian columns from the Imperial Strasse. This would give him excellent time to shift around his forces and react to whatever it was that Frederick was planning. In the distance to the east lies Kolin, which is the town where the battle got its name from. Of course, the real fighting happened here, for example in Kresor village, which is several kilometers to the west. You can probably imagine on a clear day like June 18th, 1757, the troops were wearing heavy woolen uniforms and the sun would have been beating down on them. By mid-June, Frederick had joined forces with the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, bringing his total force to approximately 33,000 men. This included 32 battalions of infantry, 116 squadrons of cavalry, and 90 artillery pieces. Daun's Austrian army, with approximately 54,000 men, occupied the formidable defensive position along the ridges. His force consisted of 46 battalions of line infantry, 9 battalions of Grenzer light troops, 43 grenadier companies, 158 squadrons of cavalry, and 60 heavy artillery pieces. Frederick initially tried to conduct reconnaissance on the Austrian troops in the town of Blainan. This is the town of Blainan. Before the eve of battle, Frederick the Great would come here to climb the church tower behind me. He needed effective reconnaissance, but he wasn't able to get it. The visibility was too poor that day. It's this lack of proper intelligence and the mapping of the Austrian positions that would contribute to the inefficient Prussian tactics and the ultimate defeat on the battlefield that day. Frederick, however, did manage to finally observe the Austrian positions from the zur goldenen Sonne, and decided to employ his developing oblique order tactic. He would march parallel to the Austrian front, then attack their right flank while refusing his own right wing. Each Prussian unit would face right at the proper moment, transforming the marching column into an attack line that would roll up the Austrian flank. The plan itself called for Major General Johann von Hülsen with the 29th Regiment Schulze and the 36th Regiment Münchow to lead the vanguard against Kreser and Kutlier, followed by successive waves of infantry in support to charge up Kreser Hill. At 2 p.m. on the hot afternoon of June 18th, Hülsen's advance guard marches on Kreser. His force, 3 grenadier battalions in the first line composed of Fink, Waldorf and Nemchowski, Schulze infantry and Münchow fusiliers in the second, and Stechow dragoons in reserve, halt and face right. 6 heavy guns deploy on his right flank and open fire on the Kroat-Grenzer light troops defending Kreser village. Simultaneously, General Zieten assembled his cavalry corps to cover Hülsen's left flank. Despite heavy fire from the defending Kroat-Grenzers, Hülsen's battalions advanced on Kreser in good order, with shouldered arms and bands playing. By 2:30 p.m., Lieutenant General Wied has arrived with his infantry division to prevent Hülsen from exploiting any gains. The Austrian grenadier battalions under Soros and Fiorenza formed a defensive link on Kreser Hill, while Major General von Andlau secured Przeworski Hill with 4 infantry regiments. Of course, the Prussians soon encountered their first tough obstacle. It was the ancient Swedish earthworks from the 30 Years' War. These were 15-foot-high ramparts encompassing several hectares that were defended by the Austrians. For the next half hour, bitter house-to-house fighting raged on through Kreser and Kutlier. Hülsen's disciplined Prussian troops methodically cleared the Croatian light infantry house by house, suffering casualties but maintaining their momentum. By 3 p.m., they had successfully driven the Banal Croats completely out of both villages. The defeated Croats fell back towards the Oak Wood, where they attempted to regroup. It's at 3 p.m. that a crucial deviation from Frederick's plan occurred. Major General von Manstein, whose troops were supposed to form part of the refused wing and remain completely defensive, unexpectedly began engaging with Croat light troops near Szczecin. This unplanned action pulled the refused wing into combat, contrary to the original battle plan. Nevertheless, Frederick, trying to keep to the original plan, ordered Lieutenant General von Treschow to support Hülsen's ongoing assault on Kreser Hill. Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau took command of part of this attack alongside Treschow, as Frederick attempted to salvage the planned flanking maneuver despite Manstein's premature engagement. As Prince Moritz reluctantly ordered his troops forward against the now reinforced Austrian position, he shook his head and muttered, "And now the battle is lost." It was to be a prophetic observation, as Daun's adjustments transformed Frederick's intended flanking attack into a costly frontal assault. While Treschow advanced, Hülsen had paused to reorganize his troops, tend to the wounded, and prepare for the next phase. His objective now was to push the Croats completely out of the Oak Wood and continue the advance on Kreser Hill. Meanwhile, the Prussian refused wing, which was now drawn even more into the general advance, pushed the Karlstadt Croats out of Szczecin. As one of Frederick's adjutants rode past and shouted to Manstein that the Croats must be driven away, he reluctantly obeyed the mistaken order. In their enthusiasm, his troops ventured too far, and they became embroiled in an assault directly on Przeworski Hill, where they began attacking Andlau's position. At around 3:30 p.m., General der Cavalry Count Serbelloni arrived to position his heavy cavalry behind Wied's main infantry position. His force included the Kavanaugh, Kolowrat, and Schleyer dragoon regiments, as well as the Deligne, O'Donnell, Portugal, and Serbelloni cuirassier regiments. It was around 4 p.m. that Lieutenant General Leopold Starnberg had arrived with his troops to form a second defensive line behind Wied's position. Daun was systematically reinforcing his threatened right flank, moving troops from his left with remarkable efficiency. At 4:15, von Sincere arrived with his division, consisting of the Deutschmeister, Baden-Baden, and Botha infantry regiments to secure the left forward Austrian position on Treasure Hill, further strengthening the defensive line. The Austrian command was demonstrating exceptional flexibility in quickly responding to the Prussian threats. Also at 4:15 p.m., Hülsen with Infantry Regiment 36 Münchow and his 3 Grenadier battalions advanced from Kreser village and pushed the Banalkreuz through the Oak Wood, opening fire on Steinberg's forces positioned on the Austrian right. Steinberg immediately counterattacked with his cavalry, forcing back the Prussian hussars and dragoons. It's at this point that 3 Austrian grenadier companies, Halle, Gaisruck, and Neiperk, along with the Banalkreuz, launch a fierce counterattack into the Oak Wood, forcing Hülsen to fall back to the relative safety of Kreser village. There his infantry and cavalry once again regroup and reform their lines for the next phase of battle. So, here we are behind Kreser village in what would be called the Oak Wood. Sadly, it only partially exists today. This location would be extremely significant for the battle to come. The Austrians would actually place their reserves here, and they would conceal their movement from the Prussians. Frederick would later on order a direct attack on the Oak Wood, because he believed it was the extreme right flank of the Austrian position. It was around 4 p.m. when Wied's infantry, emboldened by their initial success against the Prussians and the apparent weakness of Hülsen's forces retreating from the Oak Wood, advanced too far towards Kreser in their eagerness to capitalize on the momentum. This critical error, driven by overconfidence and haste, would soon be exploited to a devastating effect. At 4:15, von Krosigk's cavalry, led by the Norman dragoons, were being repositioned, and they executed a perfectly timed charge, crashing into the exposed right flank of Wied's infantry and throwing the Austrians into complete disarray. With insufficient time to form defensive squares, the normally disciplined Austrian infantry found themselves caught in line formation, ideal for volley fire, but fatally vulnerable to cavalry. Their distinctive white uniforms, which had made such an impressive sight during their advance, now made them perfect targets for the Prussian horsemen as they attempted to wheel and face this unexpected threat. Attempting to halt this devastating Prussian charge, Lutzow led the Kolovrat dragoons forward at 4:30. The elite Saxon Guard Karabiner advanced in support of Lutzow at 4:35, and they both became embroiled in the growing cavalry melee. It was also at this time that von Krosigk, while leading the Norman dragoons in their triumphant charge, was struck squarely in the chest by an Austrian canister shot. As he fell from the saddle, the momentum of the Prussian cavalry attack briefly faltered. In this critical moment, Friedrich Wilhelm von Seydlitz, a 36-year-old officer whose name would soon become legendary in military circles, immediately assumed command of the cavalry. At 4:40, Seydlitz, personally leading the cavalry, turned the tide decisively in favor of the Prussians, as he coordinated charges from multiple directions, sending the disorganized Austrian and Saxon horsemen fleeing in panic toward their own lines. While these dramatic cavalry engagements unfolded, it was between 4 and 5 that Manstein launched repeated attacks against Andelau's position on Brzezinski Hill. Despite their determination, the Prussians were thrown back repeatedly by the Austrian regiments of Mercy, Puebla, Müldke, and the Hungarian Karl regiment. This sector of the battlefield saw some of the most determined infantry fighting all day, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. I am right now on the Austrian left flank of Brzezinski Hill. In front of me you can see the village of Schochemitz. It's this hill that would become so infamous over the course of the battle. The Prussians would again and again try to scale and take it from the Austrians, but the Austrians would push them back successively. At one point, they would succeed in pushing back the Prussians all the way to the southern end of the village. Frederick the Great would become increasingly frustrated, and therefore he decided, in the next wave, to lead one of the battalions himself. To the tune of Sturmstreich, Scarcely 40 men followed him, and after a rogue Austrian cannon fire landed near them, most of the men ran away, but Frederick was unaware of this. He therefore charged the battery himself. His adjutant, Grant, would ask him if he planned to take the Austrian battery single-handedly, and being humiliated, he responded, "Wollt ihr ewig leben? Dogs, would you like to live forever?" And this is an episode which would become memorialized in Prussian history. It was at 5, in one of the battle's most heroic moments, that the Hungarian Haller infantry regiment from Steinberg's command, seeing a dangerous gap in the Austrian line, slung their muskets and charged headlong with sword bayonets into the advancing Prussians. This remarkable display of bravery ended tragically, as the Hungarians were cut down by devastating Prussian musketry and broken by the Rochow cuirassiers, fresh from their victory over the Austrian cavalry. It was at this critical moment, with the Austrian right flank collapsing and a dangerous gap appearing in their line, that von Sincere made a decisive maneuver. Under Field Marshal Daun's direction, he rotated his entire division eastward to form a new defensive line at right angles to the original position, effectively blocking the Prussian advance towards Prussia Hill. The elite Botha infantry regiment, standing at the hinge of this new defensive line, became the rock upon which the Prussian advance was shattered. Under the leadership of their young commander, Franz von Kinsky, the regiment delivered volley after disciplined volley into the attacking Prussians, and when ammunition began to run low, Kinsky reportedly held up a passing ammunition wagon at gunpoint to keep his men supplied. While the Baden-Baden and Deutschmeister regiments had initially been forced to retreat under the Prussian onslaught, they now rallied behind the steadfast Botha regiment. Sincere's quick thinking and the extraordinary discipline of the Botha regiment had transformed imminent disaster into a stable defensive position, buying crucial time for the additional Austrian reinforcements to arrive. It was at 5:45 that von Pennever led 20 squadrons of Prussian cavalry, the 3rd Leib, 1st Krakow, 11th Leib Karabiner, and 12th Kayau regiments down the Kaiserstrasse before forming them up in the cornfields for an attack on Prussia Hill. Seeing this threat, 3 regiments of Serbelloni's command advanced to meet the Prussian charge head-on, but at the last second, they unexpectedly veered away. It was not a ruse, but it was a mistaken order, and for a moment, victory seemed very possible for the Prussians. By 6, however, Pennever's cavalry came under withering fire from the well-ordered Austrian infantry and was simultaneously charged in the right flank by Saxon light cavalry, 2 regiments of Austrian heavy cavalry, and the elite Saxon Guard Karabiner. By 6:15, the Prussian cavalry broke under this combined pressure and fled towards the Kaiserstrasse, pursued by the triumphant Austrian and Saxon horsemen. Pennever's grand cavalry attack, one of the most dramatic of the entire battle, had failed completely. At 6:20, in a desperate attempt to salvage the entire situation, the Cuirassier regiment Prince von Preußen was immediately launched by Prince Moritz of Anhalt-Dessau at Steinberg's infantry. Initially successful, they were soon defeated and fled in disarray, running over their own infantry as they retreated. In the north, it was at 6:30 that the returning victorious Austrian and Saxon cavalry crashed into the milling mass of Prussian infantry and cavalry, inflicting severe casualties. 3 Prussian units were destroyed in this devastating charge, and the Prussian center was beginning to crumble under the relentless Austrian pressure. By 7 p.m., in a last desperate effort, the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern had linked up with Tryskov, combining their forces, and they began advancing together against the weakened division of Sincere. Field Marshal Daun, recognizing the danger, had ordered Anlau to move his division and the Mercy Regiment to reinforce Sincere's right. At 7:15, the Delin Dragoons charged directly into the Prussians as well, precipitating a more general attack at 7:20, with Saxon light cavalry and Serbelloni's Austrian heavy cavalry joining in. It was between 7:45 and 8 that the Prussian infantry, simultaneously attacked by Austrian infantry from the west and cavalry to the east, finally broke and withdrew. The Prussian line was disintegrating. Norman and his cavalry brigade had negotiated the earthworks and arrived on Prussia Hill, only to be met immediately by Serbelloni's cavalry, Starnberg's cavalry, and the remaining Saxon light cavalry, along with the Kolowrat dragoons. In the final phase, nearing 8:20 p.m., Starnberg's infantry and the rallied infantry of Wied advanced to support Andlau's attack, cementing the Austrian victory and Frederick's first major defeat of the 7 Years' War. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the exhausted Prussian army began its retreat. Frederick, personally devastated, rode from the field escorted only by his garde du corps. The Prussians had lost nearly 14,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured, along with 45 guns and 22 regimental colours. The Austrians suffered approximately 8,000 casualties. Remarkably, Field Marshal Daun did not pursue the retreating Prussians. In fact, he had initially ordered a retreat himself, fearing his army might be pushed into impassable terrain if the battle continued to go poorly. This order, however, was never delivered, a fortunate circumstance for the Austrians, as the battle then turned in their favour. Strategically, Kolin forced Frederick to abandon the siege of Prague and retreat from Bohemia entirely. His grand offensive had failed, and Prussia now faced the full weight of the coalition arrayed against it. The myth of Prussian military invincibility had been shattered. Yet, in this darkest of hours, the seeds of Frederick's greatest victory were sown. For at Leuthen, just 6 months later, Frederick would perfect the oblique order that had failed him at Kolin, winning one of the most brilliant victories in military history. Today, the battlefield of Kolin remains remarkably unchanged. Walking these fields, one can still grasp the tactical challenges that faced both commanders. The Swedish earthworks still stand, and from their ramparts, visitors can survey the ground where Frederick's vaunted infantry struggled uphill against withering fire. Kolin teaches us enduring lessons about life, the dangers of impatience, the folly of abandoning a sound plan, and the decisive impact of terrain and leadership. For Frederick the Great, it provided a harsh but necessary education, one that all of us must learn through failure and great defeat. Or, in his own words written after the battle, "My heart is torn in pieces, but I am not cast down, and will try on the first opportunity to wipe out this disgrace."